Welcome to Millennial Pagan Podcast, the podcast that's discussing issues and hot topics influencing the pagan world from a millennial perspective. We're your hosts, Autumn Wolf.
And Jera Stone. And in studio today, we have Tasha with us.
Hello. Hi there.
So, real quick, it's our first show back from the Yule season. How'd it go?
Welcome 2020.
Yes.
Yay. Still no Barbara Walters, though. I'm a little grumpy about that.
I saw a compilation on YouTube.
Okay.
Somebody literally took just about every single instance of her going 2020 throughout the years.
Uh-huh.
And she says it the exact same every single time from her first show to her last.
She practiced that.
Oh, yeah.
That was planned. She could just pop it out. Anyway, so how was your Yule?
It was good. It was actually pretty relaxed, pretty chill. We really didn't do too much for Christmas or New Year. We just decided to actually stay in and relax. And of course, we had our Yule gathering with AZ Reclaiming, which was pretty fun, pretty nice.
Awesome. So, and if you guys haven't gone and seen the pictures, we were actually invited to be a part of Witchcrafted, a craft fair by pretty much pagans of the area. And Jera got himself all dolled up as the Santa Odin.
Yes.
And the pictures are awesome.
Yeah, and thank you for everybody who's new listeners from that. People who've actually like posted pictures, you know, we love seeing that stuff, and just thank you not just for listening to us now, but also for making Witchcrafted such a huge event.
So unexpected. We did not expect that big of a turnout. The place was so packed.
I'm pretty sure there was at least 500 people through the door within the first hour.
Yes, no, I totally agree with you. Totally. 100%. So Tasha, how was your Yule?
It was quiet. Most of my Yules are less quiet, but I'm in the process of moving. So, we put our boots out in an empty apartment, in the process of moving. But it was really, really nice. And, it was just a very, very, modest is the best word for it, this year.
Sometimes those are the best.
Yeah.
So I actually went to the Grove of the Rising Phoenixes ritual, which was open with the Irish Cultural Center's Yule or Winter Solstice celebration. And a lot of my friends remarked on how they had to tone down the paganism because of it being open to the Irish Cultural Center as well. But it was a nice little gathering. It filled the need of a Yule ritual for sure. I got to see some friends and it was nice.
That's good.
The Grove is really good about being inclusive. I have gone to several of their rituals and will probably continue to take part in the future. They are just very, very awesome people. I think the woman's name is Michelle. I can't remember her name specifically, but she's always just very welcoming.
I think you're right, yeah, because I was surprised she remembered my name. I mean, I've seen her at a few different events, but when I went to go leave, she was like, "Bye, Autumn, sorry we couldn't talk." And I was like, "Oh, hi, I didn't know you knew my name." Hello. Hello and goodbye. So, well, we asked Tasha to come over for a very important discussion that I have been gearing to have since we started this whole entire thing. And I know Jera has been itching at it as well.
Ditto.
And that is heathenry. And the reason why it took so long was because I wanted to find just the right person. And I have sadly only skimmed over your blog, which is called The Ancient Tradition or Ancient Traditions for Modern Heathens. So you guys can go check that out. We'll repeat that again at the end of the show. And when we talked, we met at Pagan Pride. I was like, all right, this is the person that I know will cover what I want to cover and how I want to cover it. Not saying that I'm hiding things from y'all, but me and Jera both have a lot of heathen-esque things in our own personal traditions and our own personal beliefs. So we wanted to do it right. We wanted to do it and touch on some sensitive areas on it correctly. So we're just going to go ahead and dive into Tasha's coming of witch story.
Yeah.
So my coming of witch story, I was raised in a traditionally Catholic home until about the age of like 6 or 7, where we stopped going to church, but my mom still wanted us to go to CCD, which I still couldn't tell you what I learned from there, other than that.
Yeah.
Everybody in the room goes, right?
Yes. It was really around the time when I was about 11 or 12 when I started questioning those beliefs for myself, particularly because of traumatic events that were happening in my life at that point. And I kind of came to the conclusion that there were no answers in Christianity for me. And so I started doing a lot of research into a bunch of different religions. I looked into Buddhism. I looked into Wicca, just across the board, tried to find, I even read the Tao, which was a very dry read, but it was a very respectful spirituality. It just wasn't quite for me. And then I had kind of settled into Wicca because that's what felt the truest to me at the time. In which I ran into someone. Her name is Lisa. She's from Alabama, and her family is actually descendant of priestesses in the Alabama pagan community. But because of her influence in my life, she really encouraged me to learn and grow, to continue to find answers for myself. I still was not quite satisfied, and so I still kind of did a lot of back and forth into different areas of paganism, even going back to Christianity at one point after my son was born, to just try to see if, hey, maybe the answers weren't there before, but maybe they're there now. Until I kind of settled back into paganism, because once again, Christianity failed me again after the death of my second son. And so I started doing a lot more research, and I met this individual. I don't know if he would want me to say his name, so I'll just leave him nameless at this point. And he introduced me to Heathenry. Although at the time, he self-identified as Asatru, which is one of the branches of Heathenry, which just means to be true to the Asir gods. But I prefer the more umbrella term of Heathenry, just because it's a little more inclusive than just the Asir. So at the time when I was doing some research with him, we ended up doing a Samhain ritual, and he wanted his gods included, and I was going through a really, really huge block at that point. I'm a healer by nature, and so I couldn't practice. There was something blocking me, and so during this Samhain ritual, he invited his gods in, and I had this, I'm going to call it my calling. Most people would say that Odin called them to the spirituality, or Thor, but consequently the person who called to me was Hela, depending on your dialect and what you prefer to call her. And it was honestly probably the most intense experience that I have ever had in my spirituality as a whole. And so ever since that time, I kind of have just become heathen. And it's kind of become an embodiment of who I am as a person. And then the more research I did on it, the more it just fit. It's not a druidic spirituality. It is a warrior spirituality. It is very much about community and strength and the pursuit of wisdom, which is so important to me as a person. My favorite thing to say is, if I am not learning something, I'm wasting my time. And so the spirituality really just calls to me on such a personal level. And then I found out that I was Swedish, and then I was just like, okay, cool. So this all just kind of fits in really well. Especially with the whole ancestor veneration portion of heathenry.
Right.
So that's kind of my coming of which story. I was kind of a part of a kindred for a while, but I kind of separated from them when I started pursuing I don't really want to call it title or position, but I decided to become Volvastav. And traditionally, the Volvastav does not have a kindred because they need to be objective when called upon to deal with like kindred politics. So I consider myself a solitary, standalone heathen because of it.
What is the title of Volvastav?
So, Volvastav is a woman. Historically, she is very highly respected in all heathen and Scandinavian communities. If the Volva comes to your house, the lord of the house will give up the high seat to the Volvastav so that he does not disrespect her. She's called upon to be a judge. She is also typically a scythe worker, and so she works heavily within the web of weird and has a very close relationship with the Norns, which is the Verdandian Skuld. And they kind of are I think the Greeks would refer to them as the Fates. Mm-hmm. What I kind of like about the Norns is a lot of people view them as past, present, and future, whereas the heathen, or more particularly the Volvastav view on it is what was, what is, and what is owed. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily about what's going to be in the future. It's what do you owe for what you have now. So that's kind of resonates more strongly with me than what is in the future. Right.
I never really thought to look at it that way. It's actually kind of interesting. I kind of want to read more into that.
Yeah, it was really confusing at first, because when you actually start looking into the translations of their names, it really does Skuld actually does really translate out into what is owed. Mm-hmm. So like understanding that you aren't guaranteed a future of success or hardship. It's you owe the Norns for what you have in this current moment.
I like that.
Well, I think we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to dive into Heathenry as a intro lesson for everybody. Just as a warning, this may be pretty heavy, and it might be kind of long, so stay tuned. Millennial Pagan Podcast is exclusively supported by Patreon. Listeners like you can gain great benefits from your favorite show, such as...
At $1 a month, you get a personalized shout-out at the end of the next full-length episode.
At $5 a month, you receive a thank you card in the mail with a Millennial Pagan Podcast button and sticker enclosed. Additionally, $5 a month supporters have access to our monthly 30-minute minisodes.
Patreon supporters are also the first to learn about new and exciting updates to Millennial Pagan Podcast.
More benefits and exclusive content to come.
And we are back. So we just kind of went over the Coming of Witch story with Tasha. So I know we're kind of going into a little bit more of the ancestral lore of Heathenry.
So before we get into the ancestral part of it, I really would just like to go over kind of like a general overview of what Heathenry is and what Heathenry isn't.
Okay.
So Heathenry, first and foremost, is following the old Scandinavian religions, and that's like Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and just Scandinavian countries in general. They all pretty much in the Viking Age followed the same spiritual path, which has Odin as like the main god, if you will. Mm-hmm. It is something that it is inclusive, because when you actually look at it historically, the Vikings, Viking as kind of the modernized term for it, although Viking is not what they were called. It was actually a something that they did.
It was more of a title than a
right
than a race.
Right.
Well, it was an action.
Yeah, an
like
action.
To go Viking is to go relieve people of their items.
To go raiding.
Yes. But what would happen is when they would go raiding, when they would go Viking, they would be bringing back slaves, people, and their different cultures and items from their culture. And so, historically speaking, even if they brought back slaves from different countries, Muslim countries or Chinese countries, if these slaves did eventually become freed people, they were able to be a part of the community. And so, historically speaking, they were actually a lot more inclusive than they are being known for at this point. Which brings me to the point of what heathenry is not, and I know that we talked about this before. There are certain groups in the heathen community who are white supremacists. They say they are clinging to their white culture, and excluding anyone who is not.
Right.
Which is not what heathenry is about, and not what the Scandinavian cultures were about historically. So I do take slight issue with that because of that fact that they want to say that that you have to be of Scandinavian descent to be heathen, and that's just not true because of how inclusive they were historically. Something that's important to heathens is that ancestor veneration, and we actually do have a lot of rituals where we will make offerings to our Disir, which are our female ancestors. Specifically female ancestors. I couldn't tell you why it's just female and not male. That's just kind of the surviving text. Unfortunately, another aspect of heathenry is the fact that it is a Reconstructionist religion. And so we don't actually have a lot of texts other than the Eddas to go off of. And so a lot of heathenry is OPG, your own personal gnosis of your spirituality. So a lot of it is kind of, we're extrapolating details from the Eddas and from the surviving texts and trying to recreate this religion based off of what we have, which is truthfully not a lot.
Right. Right. So there's the Eddas and the sagas, which the sagas are fairy tale stories, essentially. And there's some truth to them, but that's the only surviving text. And I know we've talked a lot about that with Izzy as well. One thing that I guess I would mention, we're probably going to go over this a little bit later, is that just because your ancestors don't hail from these heathen countries or the northern countries doesn't mean you don't get to worship them in your own heathen practice. Does not mean that you don't get to be heathen.
Exactly. And when you start, one of my favorite things in the entire world is comparative mythology. And I've actually gone back and forth with my mom on this because she's, Christian still, where she will tell me a story and then I will tell her a similar story hailing from heathenry that compares to Christianity. And really, when you get down to it, when you start looking into all of these different spiritualities, there are common threads and common stories. So my grand big belief is that as far as spirituality goes, we're all really just kind of worshiping the same thing. It just
different interpretations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just kind of like there's so many different kinds of Christians, which can actually also translate into paganism. There's if Christianity is the umbrella term, then paganism is also the umbrella term.
Yeah.
But even at that same point, like there's so much similarity. It really just depends on how the gods depict themselves to these ancient tribes and countries. And so it's really, at the end of the day, all very much so open to interpretation. Kind
of one thing that I would see, is how would these people be able to interpret it, be able to recognize and familiarize themselves with these gods, so they would choose depictions that would be very, very noticeable, very recognizable to them.
Right, and especially with you see it a lot in heathen lore, where the gods will go out under different disguises and change their physical form. So there are times where Odin is not a man with one eye. There are times where he is seen in the sagas as projecting a two-eyed individual who. It's all very much so open to that interpretation and what the gods are projecting to you. And so who's to say that Odin couldn't have projected himself as God or Ra or any of these other various spiritualities? So at the basis of my belief is that we are all worshipping someone who is similar, but the nice thing about paganism is it is tailor-made to the individual, which is another thing that I really can very much so appreciate, that heathenry and paganism in general is not an actual organized religion.
Right. You have slightly organized small groups, and you can choose to be a part of them or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't fit with you, then it doesn't fit with you, and you're more than welcome to either practice as a solitary practitioner or form your own group.
Right.
That will conform to your ideals, and maybe your ideals are the same as that person's ideals, and oh my goodness, now you have a kindred.
Yep.
So we've talked a lot about Odin.
Right.
But Odin is just the tippy top guy, like Zeus is. And Odin has a lot of different fascinating stories, which we may or may not get into. But who else is involved?
So yes, Odin does definitely have a lot of stories, and we could probably dedicate a whole episode to Odin, and I sure hope that we do, because he is definitely a very, very fascinating person. Some of the other gods, there's quite a long list if you really get into it, but some of like the bigger ones are Odin, Thor, Freya, Bragi, Frigga, Balder is a really big. He is a very key figure in Ragnarok, and like the coming of Ragnarok. Everyone knows about Loki. Not a whole lot of people really delve into very deep into his children that he had with the giantess Angrboda, who, like, they have 3 children, and they're well-known figures. Hel, who is his daughter, who rules over Hel, her realm. There's Fenrir, and then there's Jormungandr, who's the world's serpent. So these are just kind of several very big people in the Aesir group.
Right. And there's multiple different levels of gods. So Aesir is...
So the Aesir are like... They're kind of a subgroup of gods. There's also the giants, the Jotuns, like Loki. He is not actually an Aesir god. He is actually he's a giant. He's a Jotun. But he and Odin became blood brothers, and so he is honored with the Aesir at the same time as he is earned a certain level of notoriety for being a very mischievous person, and who will eventually fight against the Aesir in Ragnarok with his children. So at the same time as there are people who venerate Loki and can appreciate his chaos and mischief, there's also a level of, well, there are a lot of stories where Loki and Thor and Odin are, hand in hand, and they're very close. So, and then you have like lesser, well, I say lesser, they're not actually lesser, they're just not as well known. Like I had mentioned Bragi and Ithun, Sif, Njord. Njord is the father of Frey and Freya. So there's so many different gods. On the other hand, you also have the Vanir, and both Njord, Frey, and Freya are of the Vanir, and they got traded to the Aesir during a war between the Aesir and Vanir, and so each side traded 3 of their people as kind of like a peace treaty.
And what are the Vanir?
So the Vanir, and this actually does kind of delve into history a little bit more. The common folk in Scandinavia, the farmers, the boatmen, they are much more likely to venerate the Vanir, because the Vanir are very much so, they're elves, essentially. They are the land wights. They are the keepers of the earth. The gods, they're a little bit more, the Aesir gods, they're a little more into the Aesir politics, and when you actually see into the Aesir myths and legends, you can actually kind of see that they're very human, because they're a lot more about what's going on in their world. The Vanir are more about taking care of the world. So they're a little bit more of like the druidic side of Scandinavian lore historically. So when you're putting out offerings to land wights or to the elves or the dwarves, you're actually doing more of a Vanatru type of heathenry. Because you have your Asatru who are dedicated specifically to the Aesir gods. You have the Vanatru who are dedicated specifically to the Vanir. You have Odinists, Theodism, and like the tribalist folk heathens, which is why I definitely appreciate heathenry as an umbrella term more, because I'm not dedicated to the Aesir or the Vanir like exclusively. And I believe that you shouldn't pick one over the other.
I like that. It's more of a more of like you said, like an umbrella worship.
Exactly.
It's where it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which side of the line you're reaching out to. It's whoever's needed for that specific ritual or that specific reasoning. Exactly.
So if you are wanting a good harvest, you can absolutely put out an offering to Frey and Freya, who are typically the gods of fertility, but also understanding that they are also not Aesir, they're Vanir, even though you are worshiping them as Aesir gods. But at the same time as you're putting out an offering for them, worshiping them as the Aesir, you would also put out an offering for the Vanir, the land wights, which is something that I did when I was creating my rune set, because I would have much rather, I decided that I would rather make my runes than buy them. It was it creates a much closer bond to them. But the tree that I had picked was near Native American land. And so instead of putting out like apples or honey or something that you would be able to put out in Scandinavian cultures, I thought about what the specific landwights of the area would prefer. And so I kind of decided that the more appropriate offering for my particular rune making ritual was corn and sage. And so I was trying to be super respectful towards the landwights of the Native American land.
I like that. It's a little bit like we said before, a little bit more inclusive, and it kind of spans that that ancestral plane as well.
Exactly. And understanding that that the Scandinavians aren't the only people that have ancestors and landwights that are tied to the land. And like you said, being inclusive with the Native Americans and making sure that their landwights and their gods and their ancestors are being appropriately respected.
In the way that they would have expected.
Exactly.
Right, yeah. So we mentioned that there's a couple of different things that fall under the umbrella of heathenry. So Asatru are people who only dedicate themselves to the gods of the Aesir.
Yes.
And then you said
Venatru.
So they specifically work with the spirits of land and like more like your house spirits and things like that. Like that?
Yes, exactly. So historically, you would actually have a much closer relationship to your Venatru landwights as opposed to the Aesir, because the Venatru, the landwights would be a part of your everyday life. Right. Because
I heard a lot about like most everyday person isn't going to go and worship Odin because Odin is a king of gods and god king, and he's not going to care about the serfs. But the kings and those higher up would be like, okay, now I do worship Odin because he understands what I'm going through, what I'm doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, that being said, the serfs could definitely look to Odin because even though Odin is a warrior god, he is a warrior king, something that he values just as much, if not more than strength, is wisdom. And so any serf, any person seeking greater wisdom than they have is actually venerating Odin, whether they know it or not, because Odin is the great traveler. He's the wisdom collector. He sends Hugin and Munin out every day to collect knowledge and bring it back to him. And so it seems when you look into his myths that there's a lot less fighting on his he does a lot less fighting and a lot more collecting knowledge.
So is there another I heard of Odinists. So are they just caring about Odin, or do they care about other Asatru?
So from my understanding, Odinists, they are specifically devoted to Odin. People that claim Odinist, I find that 98% of the time are also the people who are associated with neo-Nazi groups and white supremacist groups. And so I tend to steer clear of Odinists and people studying theism, which is also kind of lumped in with Odinists. I tend to steer clear of that a little bit because of that reason.
Right.
My son is half Hispanic, and so I don't appreciate people telling him that he can't be a proper heathen because of it. So they do worship Odin specifically, but they're much more likely to be less inclusive.
Of course, yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I know that's why we treaded so lightly on this topic, because I know that bothers me personally. I know it bothers, obviously, Jera personally. There was one time I was listening to another podcast, not mine, obviously, and they were at an event, and this one woman was describing her experience first diving into heathenry and how people would tell her that she could not have had an interaction with Odin because she was black. And I actually started crying, could not help but tear and cry because of exactly what we talked about before. In the past, they would have been traveling and meeting all these different people. They're not going to proselytize. That's a Christian thing, but they're not going to be secretive about their beliefs or religion, and they're going to have these conversations. If you've ever watched the show Vikings, there's one pivotal moment where Floki walks into a mosque and he's like, they're obviously so extremely devoted to what they are dealing with, but there are no idols. here. He's like, there's no idols here, and that doesn't make sense to him because in the northern traditions, there are idols that you worship. There are representations. The gods are present in their idols, and he actually stopped them from raiding in the mosque. He's like, nope, this is a place of nice worship. We're not going to do that. We wouldn't want that to happen to us. Back the fuck out. Being essentially a priest in his community, that was a good moment for me to watch.
It was, and I will admit to being a really big fan of that show.
Right.
They do condense a lot of the historical lore. They condense it down a lot, and so like a lot of stuff that actually took hundreds of years is being condensed down into like a 40 to 60 year period. But at the same time, like it's just so fascinating to see how all of this did take place. And that moment with Floki in the mosque was honestly very fascinating to me because while yes, it is a place of worship, they also in previous seasons walked into a monastery and raided and killed the priests. And so it just shows like a very interesting contrast where I think it touched something deeper than just, hey, this is a place of peace and this is a place of worship. It just seemed like he wanted to learn more about what was actually happening, which is also a very heathen thing to do because we just want to learn. We want to learn everything we can. And what we learned from the Christians at that point is that, hey, you guys want to kill us.
Yeah.
And you guys want us to renounce our gods. And these people, they just want to live in peace. They're not trying to force their beliefs on us. We just, so maybe we'll just be as respectful to them as they're being to us, type thing.
To an extent, we still need food and slaves and stuff, but at least you haven't stabbed us yet.
Right.
You didn't stab us first.
Yeah, right. I was going to say it's a very, very Odin thing to do. It's like, okay, this is something that's new. I need to know more about it. Hold up. Stop the raid.
Like, wait a second. You're not going to mess with my learning.
Yeah.
I need my education first.
So I know we were we of course touched on the topic of being inclusive as heathen. Now, something that we've talked about on the show before, of course, the LGBTQ community,
right? And
I was kind of wondering because I know I have some friends who have actually asked me where do heathens stand when it comes to their community.
Now, the one thing that I can say for certain is that there is no official standing on the LGBTQ community in heathenry. It's really going to depend greatly on whatever group you are trying to attach yourself to. Like the Asatru Folk Assembly is probably not going to be inclusive, but they're also have been recently taking a more bigoted direction. So they're also not being inclusive to very many people in general. So really my response to the question of your friends is it depends on the heathen. There are absolutely heathens out there who are a part of that community. And I have met some trans heathens, and myself personally, I welcome it. I think that the more diverse group we have, the more we have to learn. And so, but then there's also like Topher Henry. He is the president of the Asatru community. He has also voiced a positive opinion about the LGBTQ community taking part in the heathen community. And so, like I said, it really just kind of depends on the heathen and the group. I will, jumping back to the History Channel's show Vikings, they do depict Lagertha as having a female lover in Astrid. And so, and there have been texts that I have read about Scandinavia, in their history, where when a woman, gets married to a man and produces children, like once they have done their part, so to speak, in continuing to build their community, they were allowed to take female lovers. Like the females were allowed to take female lovers. As far as historically the masculine side of things, it was not necessarily smiled upon for men to have male lovers, although, I would like to think, like my blog is ancient traditions for the modern heathen, and modern life means accepting that there is more, like we know more now about sexuality and preferences, and so I think it's our responsibility to create a space for our LGBTQ brethren to be included.
Right. So my next question is, where can people find more information about heathenry in different aspects, and how can they safely go about finding a group that will be inclusive to who they are?
There are a lot of texts. I have, sitting in that corner, I have a book bag full of just some of my physical copies of books. I would definitely look at the Austro community. Their website has a lot of books that would be available. And they also probably have a pretty extensive compilation of groups that people could look into. Also, I would invite them, if they cannot find a group, to start their own group and to reach out to me, to the Austro community, to find out what they would need to be able to start their own community, and to start the snowball effect of, hey, we're here, we believe this too, and you can't keep us out. Because we want to learn too.
Yeah.
Right. I agree.
Like that. Yeah.
Well, once again, repeat your blog's name for us.
So my blog, it's on WordPress, Tasha Baker, Ancient Traditions for the Modern Heathen. I try to take a look at historically, what happened historically, and how we can apply it to our daily lives. I am a person of this age. Sometimes I do not have time to do grand, elaborate rituals, but I do take my spirituality with me every day in my daily life. And so I try in my blog to set forth easy ways that people can include heathenry in their daily life.
Awesome.
Nice.
Well, we have a couple of Patreon supporters that we have to thank, but a big thank you to everyone who stuck with us during our break. First Patreon supporter is Lara. We've had her on the show before, so everyone should say thank you to Lara. We have Cecil, Jada, and Tasha's become a new Patreon supporter as well. Yay! So if you guys don't know, you should have heard an ad somewhere in the middle splashed in of what you get as a Patreon supporter. We highly suggest you do so. You would, even at the $1 mark, you get to hear that great blooper episode everyone got at Yule. So look out for that.
Sound guy T's over here just giggling.
Yes, it was quite amusing even to myself. So that's an important thing there. Jera, where can they find you?
Of course, as always, you can find me on Twitter at Jera Stone, and of course on my Instagram, Haggard Cosplay, which coming up here within the next couple weeks. I think it's on the 18th. I'm actually doing a special event for the City of Phoenix Police Department. They're actually putting on a superhero cosplay get together, and I'm actually one of the featured guests.
Ooh,
yeah,
nice.
So that's going to be pretty awesome. I believe it's called Superhero Weekend, and if you guys just look it up, it's definitely on my Instagram.
Awesome. Well, you can find me at Autumn Wolf on Facebook and on Twitter, and you can find me on WordPress at Iron Wolf Circle. And then you can find us on Facebook at Millennial Pagan Podcast, Twitter at Pagan Pod, and Instagram at Pagan Pod. And I run our Insta. So you can also see pictures of Jera as Santa Jera there.
Santa Odin.
Oh, Santa Jera. Santa Jera! Santa Odin.
That was at the Alamo Draft House a couple weeks earlier.
No, I didn't share those pictures. You can find those on Haggard.
Yeah.
And from all of us here at Millennial Pagan Podcast, merry meet.
Merry part.
And merry meet again.